Hey there, folks. Welcome to Head, Heart, and Hustle, the podcast for creatives. I'm Alan Plummer, your host, and thank you for listening. Anyone with a side hustle or creative outlet can feel isolated from their friends, their family, and others around them who just don't get their passion. That's why Head, Heart, and Hustle exists, to help you feel motivated, learn, and just get a nice pick-me-up of creative energy from other people like yourself. Every episode, I interview a creative individual who doesn't just pretend to be creative. They've rolled up their sleeves and are producing great things because they need to. They know that being creative is part of who they are. Sound familiar? Great, you're in the right place. Now, today, I'm with Ryan Dillion. Ryan is a musician. He's a great guy. I've known him for a couple years. He and I talk about his merging of culinary arts with punk rock, with a whole host of things. It's kind of a neat little mix when you think about it. But we really enjoyed this episode, so let's dive in.
So Ryan, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, I'm excited to chat. As you know, one of the first things we like to do to start things off is ask people to introduce themselves and talk a little bit about themselves and who they are. So why don't we just start there?
Sure. So my name is Ryan Dillon. For at least for the next few months, I will continue to live outside of Boston, Massachusetts. But I'm planning my way back to Virginia, which is where I'm originally from, as well as you.
Yeah, which is kind of funny because we didn't even know this. We knew each other kind of professionally, had met a couple times. I think we talked about both being from Virginia. It amazes me how often I bump into people who are from that area and from down there. So it's a good thing.
I think if I remember correctly, I think you tweeted something about Garden and Gun magazine.
Yes.
And I was like, oh yeah, because I got that magazine as like a way to feel a connection with back home. It's really weird. I don't know if you feel this way. This has nothing to do with creativity necessarily, but I spent my first 25 years living in Virginia in various parts of the state and then left and moved to New England. And over the 10 years I've been gone, I've appreciated all the southernness of the parts of Virginia, the things about Virginia and being from there. Like I never thought that I would like pine for bluegrass music, or like country ham and things like that. It sounds like sort of silly and cliche, but it's like all those things that I kind of grew up around and had all the time. So yeah, anyway, that's a long way of saying like, so I subscribe to like Garden and Gun and stuff like that just to kind of feel a connection to home.
Yeah, so I'm the same way. Let's just say for folks really quickly, Garden and Gun, if you don't know what that is, there's probably some eyebrows being raised now. So a lot of people are, especially if you're old school, right? You're familiar with like Southern living. I'm trying to think what the other versions. So there's like what Town and Country, I guess, is one that's for like New England, right?
Yeah.
But it's almost like I don't even know what to compare it to. It's almost kind of like a very Southern culture kind of magazine, but it's very like Charleston, South Carolina, preppy, hunting with vintage shotguns that have been in your family for 5 generations, right? Like, kind of really good foods, like, what to do with the how to cook the duck that you just caught while you were out hunting today, right?
Exactly.
It's a lot of that kind of stuff. Southern can mean a lot of different things, but this is kind of, it's essentially the highbrow version. I wasn't going to call it that, but that's really what it is, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
It's funny. I didn't think that I would necessarily miss it as much as I did either. Growing up there, I couldn't, I love Richmond, but Richmond is a very different city now than it was when I left in 1997.
Oh, yeah.
When I left there, I had finished undergrad. I went to VCU. I loved going there, but there wasn't necessarily a lot happening artistically in the mid to late 90s. There were definitely creative people in Richmond. I won't say that there wasn't, but just as many people who were talented and young and creative were actually leaving and kind of heading out to other places.
Yeah.
And that really is what prompted me to kind of head up to New York. And so 2 things, I think, Ryan, that I think you kind of touched on. One is there's definitely this kind of romanticized notion of coming back, to heading back there and missing a lot of that stuff. The other thing, too, I think that's funny is I'm in a different place now, right? Like I'm in my mid-40s. I've got a family. I've got a son and a wife. I'm willing and in fact, wanting to relax a little bit and chill versus kind of what I did, 20 years ago, which was really to kind of want to be really aggressive and creatively and be doing all kinds of stuff. So I think that the pace appeals to me quite a bit. And the other thing that I think you guys will find out when you're back down there, Richmond and the South in general feels very different than it did 20, 25 years ago. Richmond has really kind of bloomed and grown quite a bit, and it's a great city, much more so than I think it was back in the 80s and 90s. So I think you guys will really enjoy it when you're back.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
That's kind of funny that you talked about wanting to leave because just the need for creativity and not finding an outlet for it there. Even though I'm in my mid 30s, so I'm a little bit behind you, but I kind of left Virginia and Richmond. So I grew up in a little town called West Point, which is about 45 minutes outside of Richmond. I went to Virginia Tech for undergrad, and then ended up in Richmond itself for a couple of years, and also sort of felt that like huge itch, and there was no way to scratch it. When I was living in Richmond, I was working as a cook and was trying to figure out how to like get into a band. I'd played in bands before, but just was having like a really hard time finding the right people and just to make it work. And it just like, it wasn't. And I was kind of the same way. I knew I needed to get out and do something because there was stuff happening elsewhere in the world. I'd been fortunate enough in my life to travel a fair amount as a young person. And I didn't end up in New York. That was kind of my ultimate goal. But I ended up in Vermont in culinary school. But yeah, but kind of for that same reason, was just like, there's not, what I want to do is not happening here. I got to go find it somewhere else. And
No, that's awesome. So you ended up, I didn't know you went to culinary school.
Yeah, so I have like a really, we'll call it an eclectic background. So just like the quick version is, so I went to Virginia Tech. I kind of backed my way into getting a degree in statistics, which was like not my goal at all. I really wasn't even sure where I wanted to go to undergrad. So the best way to kind of explain like my brain probably is like talk about my parents. So like my dad is a banker. He loves doing like engineering type construction projects. He's like very meticulous and like math oriented and that sort of stuff. And then my mom is like total artist. Like she has a degree in art. She likes to paint and craft and all sorts of stuff. And I'm kind of like a mix of the two. So I have that like technical side, but also like the need to like, create stuff. And I actually almost went to VCU. I thought about going for like graphic design or something, but really ended up going to Virginia Tech just because it was a big school, and I was like, there's lots of things that I could probably do there. And I also I got into punk, as a lot of kids. I got into punk rock in high school, and I knew, and obviously there's tons of punk rock history in Richmond, but there actually is a pretty fair history of punk and hardcore in Blacksburg. They had there's a couple houses that had been show houses for years and years and years and years, where basically for like generations of Virginia Tech students knew that if they rented at this house that they were going to put on shows, and they had a pretty good radio station there, so it felt like a good place to go. And anyway, so yeah, I backed into this statistics degree. I wasn't really sure what I wanted to do, and I had a roommate who was in the program and somehow convinced me to do it, and I made my way through. And then moved to Richmond and promptly did nothing with statistics. I had been, like I said, I was working as a cook, and that was something I had done originally as a job just to make money, and then really kind of fell in love with it. I think in sort of an interesting parallel to music, when you play, like the thing that drew me to music was playing in bands, and that working with other people to kind of create something and perform it. And there's a lot of similarity, I think, to working in kitchens. Like, you're not the only cook in the kitchen. Generally, you're working with a bunch of other cooks to kind of create something. And the working service is sort of like a performance. You all have to kind of work in sync and get it out there. I don't think I made that realization at the time, but like kind of looking back, they're pretty similar. So ended up in Richmond for a few years. That didn't really go all that great. And moved to Vermont, went to culinary school with the idea of trying to make it more in food and restaurants. did 2 year or a year and a half there in Vermont, and then ended up in Boston. And that's kind of where, and the way I ended up in Boston is kind of where the mix of my parents comes into play. While I was in culinary school, I really got into that. We had one business class that we had to take, and I'd never taken one before.
Okay.
And I thought it was a really interesting. It was just kind of interesting, like the projects we had to do. We had to design a restaurant menu and price it out and that sort of stuff.
For a business class?
Yeah, for a business class in culinary school. Yeah.
Oh, in culinary school. I got you. Okay.
Yeah. No, I'm sorry. Yeah, so like at culinary school, 99% of the classes are like, obviously like, cook some food.
Right.
In one capacity or another. But then there was one class on like computer basics, which I tested out of. And then there was like another class on business, and it was like, it was pretty rudimentary. I mean, at the time it was really interesting because I didn't know zero about business. But looking back, it's pretty rudimentary. It's basically like, so there's this thing called a P&L. You should be aware that exists. And another thing called a balance sheet. And, but it was...
You probably had more business training at this point in your life than I did. I had an English degree, and I purely just went for it because it was the easiest thing to do. I make no bones about that.
Yeah.
Anyway, yeah, so go ahead. Sorry.
No, sorry. It's, but I don't know. For whatever reason, that class kind of piqued my interest, and I got it in my head that I should do consulting, because I was like, oh, I'm really good at like the numbers piece, but I also like the cooking side. Like, what if I did like restaurant consulting stuff? And that's how I ended up in Boston. I like weaseled my way in with a small consulting group in Cambridge, Massachusetts.
So there was actually a consulting group that specializes in this kind of stuff?
Yeah, there's actually a fair amount of them. I mean, not a ton, but there was this one small group. It was the three guys.
Okay.
And somehow I got the number for one of the guys. And I called them every day for like a month until they would return my call or answer my phone call.
Right.
And finally talked to them, and they asked, they were like, what do you want, essentially? And I said, look, I said, look,
job.
Yeah, I was like, look, I'm looking for like an internship that'll hopefully turn into a job. I'm a culinary school student, and and they said, why should we hire you? And I said, I said, I'm the only cook you'll ever meet that can make a perfect omelet and do pivot tables in Excel. And and that was the line that like got me in the door.
Nice.
And so I worked with them and did restaurant related stuff worked with them for a year doing consulting work. Then did like some consulting on my own at a hotel, and then kind of morphed into working for tech companies here in Boston that focused on the restaurant industry. So
okay.
Inventory, so back office systems and ERP or labor force management, that sort of stuff. It's kind of like that. I kind of like made this niche for myself here.
So sorry, when you first started consulting, like when you said restaurant consulting, so this is bad. The first thing I thought of is Gordon Ramsay, right? And the reality shows of him running around telling everybody how horrible their food is and how they can't run the books.
Yeah,
probably certainly exaggerated, but I mean, were you doing a little bit of like critiquing of the food, or was it purely the business side of things?
No, it was. Oh, actually, it depended on what the client asked for.
Okay.
To start off, and then it depended on maybe what they needed. But yeah, it was everything from. So a lot of what I did. So when I moved here and started working for those guys, I moved here in September 1st of 2008.
Okay.
Right. So not a great year.
Right.
Right. So these consultants, like most of their business had been helping chefs or wannabe restaurant owners get a business up and going, and then now all of a sudden they had to turn around and work with their previous clients to figure out how to like keep them from falling off the ledge and going out of business. So a lot of the work that I did with them was like, how can we make how can we cut costs in a way that doesn't make how do we keep the menu, the service, all of that at the same high level that the rest or whatever level the restaurant's been at, but how do we kind of trim the fat, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
And so that involved everything from doing like really detailed budget forecasts for 12 months out, to also going in some days It was actually a really great job because like some days I was in an office crunching numbers or like building Excel spreadsheets or whatever. But then like 2 days later I'd be in my chef whites, in a kitchen working with the chef and talking to him about like, what are some better ways we can think of to like do desserts so you don't have to pay a pastry chef now, or you don't have to outsource this. You can do something that's elegant and simple that doesn't really
Right.
cost a lot. So it was really fun. It was I kind of got the best of both worlds doing that work. Yeah, I really enjoyed it, and it was it was a really interesting. It was fun for me because it was an interesting creative outlet in multiple senses. It was the how to problem solve creatively, but also how to do food creatively. It was really interesting. It was extremely stimulating, to say the
And
least.
so you went from that. Well, we can get into more of what you've done since then, but
Yeah.
I do want to talk a little bit about your childhood and what that was like, and kind of getting in, because you've evolved quite a bit. I think that sounds like probably the best word, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Going from engineering into cooking and everything. So let's go back a little bit. Let's go back to like talking about growing up, because you did a really good job explaining your parents and kind
Yeah.
of one being really right brained and one being left brained. What was that like for you growing up? Because you say you're a mix of both.
Yeah.
What was that like for your childhood? Were you a creative kid? Were you kind of creative? How did that kind of play out as you were seeing your parents and you were, a young kid and then turning into a teenager?
Is interesting. I would definitely say I was super creative as a kid. My mom was always encouraging of art projects, and you know, s- my parents were really good. They bought me like cool toys like Legos and things like that. So a lot of my play was around building things.
Which, okay, it makes sense. You went to engineering school. That totally gels. I get it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So a lot of building things, a lot of drawing and my I never actually kind of realized it at this point, but until talking through. But most of the stuff that my mom did creatively,
Hmm.
she would do some like oil painting every once in a while, but most of it was like crafting. So most of it was like manipulation of physical things as opposed to making a drawing or whatever. So
Right.
my mom did a lot of woodworking type stuff. So we had like band saws and things like that in the garage, so we could make shapes out of wood and then paint them, and or whatever it may be. So it was a lot of that type of work. And all of that work, or all that kind of play, I definitely associate exclusively with my mom. My dad, not really. So it would definitely not until I'll be 36 in July. So really, honestly, it's
Yeah.
only been the last couple of years I've really been able to see any type of or recognize, I guess I should say, any type of like creativity from my dad. Like he's pretty, he's like Ward Cleaver. Like like I love him to death, but he's pretty straight laced and like
Right.
he reads for what he does for fun. Like he works at a bank, and then when he comes home, he likes to do home improvement projects. And so it hasn't really been until I bought my own house and he came up and to help me like fix some stuff that I kind of worked through some of those home improvement projects with him to see like just how his creativity manifests itself. But it's not
Yeah.
like no one would ever call him artistic, but at
No,
all.
but I think you're right. There's a difference between artistic and creativity,
Right,
right? So
right.
totally get it. But I mean, you can appreciate this, having been a chef, right? I mean, there is something creative about doing home improvement stuff, right? If the
Totally.
whole point of creativity is to physically create something, and you're making that switch from consuming things to truly physically creating something. Man, home improvement is spot on. Now, to your point, that's absolutely may or may not be artistic,
Right.
but yeah, if you're redoing a house or renovating a bathroom or whatever,
Yeah.
you're certainly creating something out of
Right.
that. Absolutely.
Yeah. I mean, I remember we were having this conversation, and he's because he certainly couldn't. It's funny because he does tons of work on his own that he could certainly pay someone else to do, like
Right.
tile work, or basically he'll do anything in a house except for like drywall, like
Okay.
like and I finally had a conversation with him about why. Like I knew he enjoyed it, but I kind of wanted to know more why. And it was for him it's like it's a mind game. He basically was like, well, someone else figured out how to do this, and if,
Right.
if I can't figure out how to do it, then that means that's son of a bitch was smarter than I am, and I'm not going to let that happen. You know, so like, so it's almost like a weird ego-driven thing in a certain sort of way. But I think it's just a puzzle for him. But it's kind of funny. But going back to like growing up with the more artistic type of things that my mom was into, I don't want to say I think as a kid it didn't bother my dad, but you know, when I got to my teens and, you know, like was really into punk rock and music and wanted to buy a guitar and play, he was extremely against that.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. He
was it fear? Because a lot of parents, right, in our age group, you're about my brother's age, and a lot of our parents who were baby boomers had that fear of us not being able to kind of make a living, right? And that kind of fear of, oh God, don't become an artist. You're going to be living in my basement when you're in your 50s, right?
No. Well, I think there was part of that. I think that was more his fear when I decided to go to culinary school. I think for the music, it was his quote to me when I was like 16 was, if you have a guitar, you're going to want to play in a band. And if you play in a band, bands play in bars, and bars have smoking and drinking and, like, you know, things of ill repute.
Right.
And so that was kind of his parenting style was very much like, if you're not around any sort of temptation, then you'll never have a chance to be tempted to do anything bad. So he was very into like sheltering my sister and I. My parents,
which always comes back, right?
Yeah.
As parents, I think about my son. I was like, man, because then at least in my experience, when you shield kids from that, then when the gloves come off, it's time to play catch up.
Totally. It's kind of interesting. So yeah, so my mom has always been encouraging of my kind of like artistic proclivities. My dad was very much more practical. You know, like even when I went to college, you know, he was kind of one of those dads that was like, no, you need to have a real major so you can get a real job. Can't do anything.
Yeah.
So that kind of came into play then. And then when I went to culinary school, he didn't. He was not into that. He thought it was a terrible idea. You know, yada yada. He didn't quite understand.
So you ended up cooking then. You said you started cooking basically just to make ends meet, to get a job, right? And then that kind of evolved into that. It wasn't like as a teenager that you found it or anything. It just kind of became out of necessity, and you were like, all right, I thought I could do this. I think I could do this.
Yeah, it was my first job ever when I was like 14 or 15, whatever, I guess it was 15. I worked in a restaurant bussing tables, and then did like wash dishes, and I kind of, you know, did that, you know, off and on through college and what have you. And then it was just a job. It was just something to do to make some money. And you know, and usually at a restaurant, you know, at least back then, you know, as a dishwasher, I could usually get a couple free beers at the end of the night and stuff like that. And there was, you know, and there was always girls that waited tables to talk to. So it wasn't all that bad. But it was definitely not. I didn't see any of the creativity. I didn't see anything beyond that. But I ended up at this one restaurant after I graduated. Well, I was still kind of trying to figure out what I was going to do after graduation, and made the mistake, I guess you could say, of telling the chef. Like I finished all the. I at that point had washed dishes for long enough that I was really good at it. And so I was like, hey, I'm already caught up on all the dishes. Like I have nothing to do. Like, can I, you know, do you have anything else you need to do? So he just said, oh, sure. And then basically over the course of the next few weeks, like morphed me into a prep cook. And you know, had me like washing dishes and then peeling carrots and doing all that sort of stuff. I don't know. And it was sort of enjoyable, but it still didn't like pull me in until, the actual moment, it has nothing really to do with creativity, but the thing that like hooked me in the cooking was I was making salad dressing for the restaurant, and they had this big stand mixer, so kind of like a KitchenAid mixer, but like gargantuan. Like we jokingly called it the Hansel and Gretel mixer, because you could mix up children in it if you wanted to. It was massive. I mean, it was like a 30-gallon thing.
Oh my God.
Yeah,
okay.
It's just crazy.
I can't imagine how much salad dressing you'd make in it, but okay.
Yeah, it would be like 6 5-gallon buckets of dressing. We'd do that once a week. It was insane. But I was making, so I make a salad dressing. I don't know if you've made a salad dressing, a vinaigrette before, but you know, you have to pour the oil in slow, right, as you're mixing the base. Well,
Correct.
I didn't know this. Well, I didn't know the reasoning behind it or whatever. But I'm like, well, I'm a college grad. I went to Virginia Tech. I'm smart. I know that if I puncture a hole in the bottle, I can get the airflow in, and I can just dump all the oil in quick.
Oh.
Right? Yeah. So you know where this is going. So I'm thinking I'm like smart doing this. The chef walks by what I'm doing, and he screams at me like, "What are you doing?" And I was like, I'm making the salad dressing. I'm like, look, I'm gonna be done in 5 minutes. What do you have next? And thankfully, he saw how dumb and ignorant I was at that moment. And he didn't yell at me anymore. He just stopped the machine and said, okay, look, I'm going to explain to you why you're wrong. And then we're going to go through this. And he explained to me like what an emulsion was and how salad dressing worked. And I don't know, man, just something about that just clicked. And I just started asking him a million questions. He gave me his copy of The Professional Chef, which is the textbook from the CIA, the Culinary Institute of America, where he went to school. So he gave me that book and was like, here, why don't you read this? And like, I read it cover to cover in like a week or something ridiculous. And that was when I was just really hooked. Once I started learning like some of like the basic science of how things work and some of the fundamental techniques. And then you kind of get a few stepping stones, and then you can start to understand how to use the creativity a little bit. And that just had me hooked. And so I was off and running cooking for a few years, and then decided to go to culinary school. Yeah,
that's awesome. So, and you still play guitar today?
Yeah, I'm in a band still. I have a show Thursday night.
Oh, nice. What kind of music do you guys play?
So the band I'm currently in is like we're kind of like early 80s like post-punk kind of stuff. So like I don't know, we're sort of like a punk rock band. We're what you would call a punk rock band in like 1981. But it's fun. I've played in a number of bands here in Boston. Actually, Boston's kind of an interesting city to find other musicians. I was, because Berkeley College of Music is here, so there's tons and tons and tons of musicians. But it's interesting trying to find people. I don't know how. So coming up through the school of punk rock, like I don't know how to read music. So sometimes it can be interesting playing along with like Berkeley grads who know everything about how to read music and theory and all that stuff. But I know, like, when I know I can write a song and I may not know, exactly I may not know why it works, but I know that it's a good song. I wouldn't call myself a prolific writer, but all the bands that I've been in have, contributed. So most of the bands that I've been in, or at least the last few, generally we write together. Or what happens in the current band is most of the bands I've been in have been more collaborative writing. Like someone will bring in like, hey, I have this riff or I have this idea, let's figure out how to make it into a song. And usually kind of like everybody throws their piece in. The current band I'm in is a little bit more different because it's we have written one song that way, but almost all the rest of the songs are one of the three stringed instrument players. So I play bass in this band. So either myself or one of the other two guitar players will come in with a fully formed song. Then the singer will add lyrics on top of it. We may like switch out, change some arrangement, or maybe possibly change a key if like we think the singer will sing it better in a different key or something like that. But so it's kind of fun because it's a little like in previous bands. I like I said, like it was more collaborative. So all you kind of had to have, if you wanted to play, you basically just had to have a riff. Like, or if you say play, if you wanted to like contribute, you basically just had to have a riff or two, or like, hey, this part, I think it might be a chorus. Like, does anybody got like a verse that would go with it? So for me, like my focus for many, many years is more of like, let me write some really cool riffs and kind of parts to a song. And I didn't really focus all that much on how do I put these together into a song that makes sense. So being in this band for the last couple of years has really kind of pushed me more in that direction to figure out, take that next step and say, how do I make this work for a full song, which has been really fun.
That's awesome. So you just started writing songs with some of the bands, you guys kind of, I guess it just kind of evolved at some point. As a musician, I guess you can't be in a cover band forever, right?
Yeah, I've actually never, I can't say I've never been in a cover band. I've done a few like one-off shows where we played only covers, but almost all the bands I've been in for an extended period of time were all originals.
That's impressive.
Yeah, so starting from 19 to like almost 36, so like 17 years. Oh my god,
that's awesome.
That's a long time.
That's very cool. Now, Who are so when you talk about like kind of early 80s punk, so I'm a punk fan myself, but for me it's definitely kind of two things. One is British punk, definitely Clash. I'm a huge Clash fan.
Yeah,
I like Fugazi, right, growing up in Virginia, but the whole DC scene I never kind of quite got into.
Yeah.
You're about my brother's age. You guys probably like a lot of the same different bands. For me, in the probably the late 80s or the mid 80s, I liked a lot of the surf punk that was coming out of California.
Yeah, I'm a huge fan, definitely a huge fan of like the early 80s Southern California punk scene, like Red Cross, Black Flag, Circle Jerks,
Yes.
like the
Circle Jerks, Agent Orange. Do you know Agent Orange?
Yeah.
Voices in the Night that is just one of my go-tos from when I was a teenager. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, I think so. The Descendants are out of that scene, and they're probably my favorite band of all time. Like
Yep.
I love and the Minutemen. There's so many good ones, and then there's also like some other like Husker Du. They're from Minnesota. They're like Husker Du and the Replacements, kind of in that scene. Yeah, there's some of the DC bands. Like I liked Minor Threat. They're kind of that same time period, but you know what's actually, this is sort of funny. Like, so growing up in Virginia and kind of getting into punk rock, like understanding like the various scenes, like, yeah. So I listened to like bands from DC. I listened to a lot of bands from like the Philly, New Jersey area and like LA, whatever. But I really didn't pay much attention at all to bands to like punk and hardcore bands from like New York or New England. So it was really kind of when I moved to Boston. So the first band that I played in here was a band called The Enemy Within. We were a Boston hardcore band. The drummer was the original drummer for a very famous Boston band called Blood for Blood. You know, and like we ran in that scene. Like I'm now friends with a lot of these original like Boston hardcore dudes. But it was so funny because they're like, "Oh, you like punk rock and hardcore?" I'm like, "Yeah." They're like, "Have you heard of this band? Heard of that band?" And they were all like Boston bands. I'm like, I have no idea who any of these people are. And it was like the worst thing that I could do because I just lost all credibility.
You lost all yeah, exactly.
Like right from the get-go. Like I had barely even heard of Blood for Blood, and like it was just kind of funny. I was like, sorry guys, like there's all these other hundreds of bands that I was listening to instead of you. But it's like a never-ending, like you cannot listen to all the records in the world. When I was at Virginia Tech, I worked as a radio DJ. There's a station in Blacksburg, WVT. It's like sort of associated with the school. I had a couple shows on there for 4 years. A friend of mine, Brian, he and I ended up getting a punk rock show. They didn't have a punk rock show, so we asked if we could do one. We had to like audition and stuff, but we did like, we called ourselves, it was Brian and Ryan, the Sunday School Dropouts. That was our name. And we just played punk rock stuff. But the station was really awesome because so their whole ethos was, we'll play anything that you can't hear on any of the other radio stations in the area. And when I say anything, I meant anything. So the station would have everything from like jazz, like really good jazz, to blues, to like that, you know, Americana, like really awesome underground hip hop, punk rock, metal, like electronic, like it was just everything. And that was like such an amazing musical education for me, because coming in as just like a punk rock guy, and like there's a million punk rock bands you could go through, but like just to be the punk rock guy and then all of a sudden like going into the record store and buying like, all right, I need this bluegrass record, I need this black metal album that I is out of print, and I need, you know, these 3 hip hop records or whatever. It's really fun. There's no way that I have enough time in the world to consume music at that same pace that I did back then, but it was a really great education.
Well, and it is fascinating because for every band you've heard of, right, or anybody's heard of, there's about 10 others behind it, or 10 other musicians behind it that were influences or anything that, to your point, unless you're kind of in the same region or around at the same time, you kind of miss out on them. And it's almost like you're rediscovering those or discovering those when you move or you get into a certain genre or anything. It's a lot. It's almost impossible to keep up with all that stuff.
Yeah, there's so much history. It's so many. It's been really fun to kind of realize like how rich you hear, at least especially like in punk rock and stuff. You hear about these like little pockets of scenes all over the country or the world or whatever. It's been really fun to like basically grow up in one of those scenes and then move to another one and like learn this whole deep second history. It's like a daunting task, but it's really interesting.
I remember the music scene from my brother because he was really into it in Richmond, and then thinking of what I remember in the late 80s when I was in high school, and it was essentially like Southern college rock, right? Like remembering REM when they were still a college band, and 10,000 Maniacs, and right, a whole different kind of mindset.
Yeah.
But it was that different types of things, and then you leave, and it's completely a new world and new kind of discoveries from that.
Yeah.
Totally. I want to talk a little bit about all the different things that you've done, right? Because we've touched on a lot. We've talked about playing instruments, writing music, cooking, helping your dad with stuff around the house. Like, you've done a lot of different creative things in your life. What do you think motivates you in all those like creative pursuits in terms of learning the guitar or starting to write music or wanting to learn to cook? What do you think? Is there some kind of commonality in a lot of those things that kind of sparked your interest?
I think there's a couple different things. One of them I sort of touched on earlier. I think especially with music and with definitely with cooking, there's a I don't know what the right phrase for it is, but there is a kind of a collaborative communal piece to it that I really gravitate towards. Like I don't think I'll ever be like a singer-songwriter on my own, with an acoustic guitar up on stage. Not that there's anything wrong with that. I listen to a lot of that stuff, but
Right.
I'm just not driven that way. Like, I listen to tons of podcasts and read interviews with guys that musicians that I look up to, and there's guys that hear them talk about how like whether they were famous or not, or whether they had a record deal or not, the songs are still in them and they're going to come out and they're going to have to play them for somebody. So for me, I still have an itch, but it's more of like I need to like get together with like two or three or four other guys or girls or whoever, as I played in bands with girls too. Two or three or four other people, and come up with some song that like just gets me excited, and then go play it for other people. And that piece is what drives me for music, and it's sort of similar for cooking. I mean, there's obviously cooking's a little bit different because everybody has to eat. And so some days cooking is just, I'm making dinner for my family, but I still love, my favorite thing to do is to get together with cook friends of mine, like that I've either, known for a long time or worked with or whatever, and get in a kitchen with them and then just make dinner for however many people we can and do as much as we possibly can. In that same sort of similar vein, like the working together and talking through ideas. I think part of it for me, I know for me, for how my brain kind of works, like my brain, I don't know, I tend to like think through things like really, really fast and really rapid paced. And so I know like even like at work that has nothing to do with necessarily creativity, I find one of the things I find to be very helpful for me is to sit with someone and talk through things. I think it like forces my brain to slow down because I have to figure out how to articulate it and get it in my mouth. And so I think I'm drawn towards creative endeavors where like that is a natural part of what we do. Because I've done I do like to do other things. I try and push myself to do all types of other artistic endeavors. Like I've done like blacksmithing classes and will draw and write and all these things. And the ones that really stick with me are the ones where I'm working with other people to get it done.
So definitely that kind of collaborative approach.
Yeah, like I've been told for years that I'm a very good writer, and people have asked me, like told me like, hey, you should write a blog, you should do stuff, and like they're not wrong, but like it's for whatever reason it's harder for me to figure out like how to get it out of my head when just me by myself. Like I've actually like in kind of thinking through some of this stuff to in preparation to talk with you, kind of came up the idea of like maybe if I do a blog or something, maybe I should do it with someone else, because then that would bring that collaborative piece into it. Because I really think that is key for me somehow. Like that is definitely like that's a key that like unlocks the door to get the stuff out of my head.
So somebody to bounce the stuff off of and not work in a vacuum.
Yeah. I really don't like doing stuff in a vacuum all that much.
That's interesting, because that's one of the things I think for me that's kind of the strongest. I've tried to do stuff in the collaborative environment when I was younger and I was writing. I wrote plays back when I was in Richmond, and I joked that I could never get anybody to workshop them, which is a bullshit excuse, right? Like I had friends who were actors, right? We all worked at King's Dominion together. I could have bought pizza and beer, and we could have workshopped, the plays that I came up with. But I tended to avoid that for whatever reason, and something about kind of for me, that kind of solitary pursuit is where I tended to feel my most comfortable. And I don't know why that is. It's certainly not a conscious thing for me, but I seem to have better luck when I'm just kind of hunkering down on my own. These interviews kind of the exception. But if you think about the time I put into each episode outside of the interviews, I mean, you and I finish talking, if this ends up being an hour or an hour and 10 minutes, I'll put in another 15 hours cleaning up and editing and prepping and building websites, and that's all solitary stuff.
Right, right.
And just like my own writing that I've done and everything else, even now trying to teach myself guitar, I've never really thought about trying to play with anybody. It's just kind of purely me wanting to learn how to play along with music just for my own benefit. So that's interesting. It totally makes sense. I think it's just personality differences. I wish I could be more like that, but I just never have been.
Yeah, I definitely wish that I could figure out a way to make that, to get a similar type key where I didn't necessarily have to do stuff with other people. Just because, I mean, you know this, like being older now and married with a kid, there's, I have a much more limited time in my day
Yes.
to be able to do stuff. I feel very fortunate that, I'm still, that I can play in a band. And I have a wife who is like very, very understanding and like gets me. So she is very encouraging of like, I mean, she basically is like, you need to be in a band just because if you don't, you're going to drive me crazy.
That's a good spouse. I mean, let's be honest. I mean, there are certain rights. So I joked with one of the interviews, one of the other musicians that I talked to, Rob Muller, he talked about creative constipation, right? I mean, that was his term for it. If you don't get that outlet, then your personality suffers. You kind of become miserable.
Yeah, totally. Like,
God bless her for recognizing it, man. That's awesome.
Yeah. I mean, I remember we used to, when I was playing in the hardcore band, and I've played in like metal bands and other stuff too, like very aggressive music. And people always comment like, oh, how are you guys, like, you guys must be really angry. And it's like, no, like, we're actually like not, because we get to do this. And like, this is like a way to change.
Stage, yeah.
Yeah. It's a way to like, I mean, I've had friends, I won't name any names, but I've had friends that I played in bands with where like, there was like a noticeable like calmness after we got done playing a set. I'm sure it happens with me too. I just don't necessarily notice it in myself, but like there's got to be some, because there's definitely like a dopamine release, and like when you just like rip through a set, you get that out. But yeah, but go back to, I would love to be able to figure out a way to unlock that so I could kind of do more on my own and not necessarily need some collaboration.
It may just be how you're wired. I mean, it's not that any one way is right or wrong. Like when I was younger, I thought I would have loved to have gone into film, right, and loved to have done films and stuff, right? So think back to the early 90s and all the independent films and everything else, right? Quentin Tarantino gets big and everybody hears about Sundance for the first time and everything. So many people then wanted to make films, but I struggled with kind of how to get other people on board and kind of make something a reality when it involved people beyond myself. Which is ironic, given that my job now is to motivate other creative people and run a team.
Right.
But when I was young, it was totally outside of my element. So let's shift gears for a second. I want to ask about your daughter. So we talked about the kids thing. I like to talk about my son, and I talk about his kind of creative impulses. Are you seeing any of that in your daughter at this point, or have you guys talked about kind of personality traits, or does she see you play the guitar around the house or anything like that?
Oh yeah, she is super into anything creative. I mean, I should also add, speaking of awesome spouses, my wife who constantly says that she's not creative but is actually super creative. She does lots of crafting. Like when we got married, we didn't have a lot of money, so she made all the decorations. And she's constantly like creating stuff around the house. So in very much the same way that I grew up is how kind of we're raising my daughter Ellie. So she has, an easel and paints and crayons and markers, and she sees me play the guitar. She wants to play. She asks to play. So she,
nice.
We do chalk outside. She loves, and then same thing. We have Legos and blocks and whatever. So she does it all. It's basically her days. When she's not watching Curious George on the TV, her day is essentially going from one creative plaything to the next.
That's awesome.
And I would say like we don't, we're not pushing anything on her. We basically try and like present opportunities. Like, hey, here's some markers. Like, what do you think of these? And so, but she just asks. She knows what they are, and so she asks for everything now. So it's totally all driven by her and what she wants to do. So I'm kind of interested to see, how that continues to manifest itself over the next, the rest of her life, really.
It's kind of fascinating to see. Like with my son, there was definitely this moment. He's gravitated towards drawing. He's always been drawing. And I started, I started seeing him draw all the time, even when the TV was on and even when he was doing other stuff. And even now, there's markers and crayons all over the house. He's constantly drawing. And he gets, like, Ryan, he almost gets, like, manic about it. You know what I mean? You know when you get that impulse, right? And you've got to, like, get something down on paper or kind of, you have to be able to get it out or do something with it because you want to get it out of your head, right?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
He does that with drawing. So he'll get an idea and he'll draw it. And he'll draw the same thing like 7 times. And each time he'll focus on a different area of detail so he can get it right.
That's
so it'll be like 20 minutes straight of him just cranking through and drawing and drawing and drawing until he gets it right. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But it's fascinating to see because that's how I am about writing. And it's amazing. And there's other areas too, right? Like he likes to make up his own songs. He dances around the house. It's fascinating to see. But even when he was a little toddler and everything, there was always some of that. Like, you know, when he was barely learning how to walk, he danced as much as he walked, I think. It just started. You know what I mean?
Yeah. That's really interesting that he does the iterations of the drawings. I mean, I think that's like I wouldn't say that's like a normal like impulse for most people. I think maybe so, but I mean, I definitely think that is like I remember in culinary school, a chef pulled me aside and gave me the compliment of me doing that sort of work. We were shaping pastas, like filled pasta, raviolis and stuff, and I was doing it like, you know, she complimented me on that same sort of thing. Like, hey, like, I like how you're like practicing this like over and over, like you're doing it more than like everybody else or whatever. But I mean, you know, I was 24, not 4. It took me that long to kind of figure out that that's what, you know, that you need to have multiple times at trying something before you're going to really get it.
Well, my son's really hard on himself too. And he gets an image in his head and he wants to get it right on paper.
Yeah.
And that's just what he does. And it's kind of fascinating to see. It'll be curious to see how that evolves when he grows up. But it's constant. It's constant with him. I mean, we go to pick him up from kindergarten or even in daycare, and every day I swear I come home with like a ream of paper of stuff that he's drawn. If I don't go to pick him up from school and there's fewer than like 10 pictures that he's drawn that day, that's a surprise for me.
That's interesting.
It's crazy. Constant. But yeah, it's fascinating to see how the kids kind of pick up on that. And like to your point, I think everybody's creative. I think for a lot of times when we're kids and our kids, it's a question of kind of what they see and what the norm is around the house for that kind of coming out.
Totally.
Neither one of my parents were necessarily creative. That was honestly, when I was a teenager, that was my act of rebellion. I never really kind of struck out and acted out that much as a teenager, but it was almost like a form of isolation to separate myself from my family so I could kind of do my own thing.
Right.
And so I had all this stuff going on in my head, and so you just start to put it down on paper. And I didn't realize it at the time, but it definitely was my form of rebellion against kind of my childhood and my parents.
Right. That's interesting.
Yeah, I think it comes out in different ways for different people. Absolutely. So, you know, one of my favorite questions to ask everybody is how they define creative success. So I'm really curious as to how you would define that for you.
Oh man, that's
You knew this one was coming.
How I define. I guess for me, I feel successful creatively when it's like an immeasurable thing, really. But it's more of like when I feel like I have done the best I can or given it the most that I could. So like, you know, there are times there, you know, like I'm pretty hard on myself when it comes to a lot of the creative work, as I think most creative people are. You know, we're our own worst critics. But I mean, there have definitely been times where I have cooked meals, whether it's professionally or just in my own home for people, where they raved about it, but I knew, like, you know what, like the seasoning and the sauce was a little off or whatever. And sometimes it's nitpicky and sometimes it's not. But then there's other times but there's definitely plenty of times where I know, like, I nailed it. It's gone. I don't know. It's just like an internal feeling. And same thing with with playing live or crafting a song. Like, it's a really hard one to answer, but it's just something that I feel more than anything else. Especially like with, you know, really focusing more on songwriting the last year and a half or 2 years, that learning how to craft it, how to shave off. You know, one of the interesting phenomena I've noticed, sorry, this is another little aside, and I don't know if you've noticed this as well, but it was something I see in not everywhere in music, but in a lot of music, definitely in a lot of cooking and a lot of other artistic endeavors. Because so like one of the other things that not only do I like to like create on my own, but I do like to go to see live music and go to art museums and kind of explore all that stuff as well, just for kind of like creative fuel. But one of the things that I notice is like as a creator progresses, there's almost like almost everybody follows this interesting like curve where as they start to acquire newer, more and more technique, they continue to like add those to whatever their creative output is. And then at some point there's like a peak and they realize like that they don't need all of that stuff and it drops off. And then it becomes like this much more simplistic but better output. And what I mean, like I see this a lot in chefs, or young cooks. They come up and like they learn about some new ingredient or some new technique, and it'll be like they'll put up a dish and it'll be like 45 ingredients, like it'll be like 17 different herbs and flowers and whatever have you,
Right.
but then you're like, but then and like it may or may not be good, or a lot of times what it is, it's like it's good but it's like not quite there, like, and then sometimes it's like hard to pick out like what exactly why it's not creatively successful necessarily. And then you might have a dish by like an older chef, or like, I mean, some of the best food I had was cooked by an old French chef who was like 75 and made things with like 3 ingredients, and you're just, but like he knew exactly how to do it perfectly. He didn't need everything else. And when you only have 3 ingredients, there's not a lot to hide behind if you make a mistake. And so I think when I feel like I kind of knowing that creative arc, I definitely, so I whenever I can tell that I am, on that downswing back towards simplicity, I definitely feel like I'm on the way towards creative success. Like I know, like I kind of know that like, all right, I'm gonna get closer to that feeling, whether it's like in creating a song or whatever. Most of the time that I found over the last year and a half, like when I'm writing a song, the moment that I know that it's right is when I take out a part or like cut out a verse and a chorus or something like that. It's like, what, I don't actually need that. We can only do 2 verses and chorus and go right from the middle 8 to the ending or something like that.
There's a certain amount of confidence that comes from that, right? Like to your point, there's a level of competency to acknowledge that more is not always better, which is kind of almost the opposite of our instincts when we're young.
Right. Yeah. And it's kind of funny you say that. I mean, like we were saying earlier, like I've been doing music for 17 years ish, but it's taken that long really for me to get to the point where I'm even remotely confident enough to be like, okay, this is all it really needs and we'll be fine with this. And like, it's got enough of a hook, blah, blah, blah. I'm really interested to see, I have no intentions, especially, when I moved to Richmond, like I have no intentions of stopping, playing in bands. So I'm really interested to see like what my next band ends up being like and where that takes me.
So maybe you will end up becoming like a solo hardcore singer-songwriter. Who knows, right? Never say never. No,
it's true. There's part of me, going back to that needing other people to kind of help get the creativity out. There's part of me that wonders how much confidence and self-doubt play into that, and if there was like, I don't know, it's one of those questions like I try and ask it myself, but it's kind of a hard one for you to answer on your own. But I'm kind of curious like how much that, I do think that there is part of it like as you said, like that I'm just wired to really like that, but there's part of me that also wonders like, man, maybe if I was a little bit more confident in certain parts of my my creativity, like.
Well, but you do. I mean, let me rephrase that a little bit. So you brought up some stuff, right? So you talked about writing songs on your own and taking them to the band. I mean, you're doing that on your own, right? I mean, like you may not be writing lyrics, but that certainly sounds like you're kind of doing it as an individual. I'm sure that as a chef, if you're playing around with new dishes or ingredients, there's a little bit of that experimentation or things that happen on your own. So,
yeah,
I think it's probably a balance of the two. It might just be, to your point, it might just be that you prefer or kind of really identify strongly with that collaborative aspect of it.
Yeah, I see more of like the solo pieces of that work for me that's like the preparation for getting to the point where I can kind of scratch the itch. Like that's all right, we need to have songs so that we can play a show and
right.
I can feel good after the show. Or right. I need to figure out how to do this dish or make this sauce right or whatever it is so that I can do the dinner party for, 8 people and just nail it. So yeah, there is a lot of solo preparation that does happen. You're right. But I think that it still is ultimately to serve that collaborative, like, creative itch.
So, what advice do you have for other people that are creative? What have you learned? What words of wisdom do you have for other people?
I think you just have to, like, accept the fact that you're just gonna, like, screw stuff up. People always ask me, especially like now, because like I'm not a cook. I work in an office, and so when people find out that I was a chef, they always ask me a million questions, and like one of them is always like, "How'd you get so good?" And it's like, I got so good because I like burnt so much shit. Like I just burnt so many things. Like I messed up so many like pots of soup and chickens, and like I've dropped like I've like all the worst stuff that happens on like Top Chef and like Kitchen Nightmares. Like I've done all of them. All of them I have done at least once. You just have to do that. You just have to go through all that stuff and then like learn from what happens. And it's kind of two things. You have to get over the fact that you're going to mess it up, and be okay with it, and then you have to be able to learn from it as well. Like those are the two biggest ones. And then kind of like going along with that, I think is like just having patience, because you have to go through that failure period, and you'll go and you never get out of the failure period totally.
That was hard for me. I don't know about you, but that was a struggle for me when I was younger, because you spend all this time and energy on your first kind of big project or what you do or whatever, and you want it to be a success. And right, in hindsight, you look back and you're like, God, there was so much more work that needed to happen after that.
Yeah.
But you don't realize that at such a young age, and your heart's in it, and your soul's in it, and your blood's in it, and you're kind of like, okay, I created this. I want it to be successful, and you're nowhere near ready yet or accomplished to have that. And that's just painful and brutal. And thank God, at least for me, that I was naive enough and positive enough to kind of keep on pushing through.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I'm still, even this far into it, still plagued with that at times. I'm at least thankful enough to know that I still have to be patient, but it's still like sometimes even the failure stuff still like still just gets to me. But I get over it quicker. Like I think I said earlier, like I took a blacksmithing class, and it was way more. It was like I took it, and it was so clear. I don't know what I really expected, but it was very clear to me within like 20 minutes into the class that I was like, holy shit, it is going to take me like 5 years to even get sort of okay. And I was so discouraged after taking that. I mean, I finished the class and like I made the piece. I still have it. But I was like, like my plan prior to going to the class was like, all right, cool. I'm going to take this intro class, and then I'm going to sign up for like their 6-month course. And then I'm going to like, I'm like going on Reddit and like all these like other internet sites, like looking at like plans for like my own like smithy to put in my garage or like other crazy stuff. And I'm 20 minutes into this class and I'm like, oh God, I'm like, there's no way I gotta, and so like all that got scrapped. I'll get back to it eventually.
Right.
But like, that stuff happens to everybody, and you just kind of gotta.
But it's good though to want to learn that stuff, right? I mean, like that's in some ways it is kind of humbling, because if it's worth doing, it wouldn't be that easy.
Yeah, that is so true.
I think it's probably a positive thing in my mind to go into it without focusing on the negatives, right? Like that's a hard thing to get smacked in the face with, to say, holy shit, there's a lot of talent involved in this, and a lot of years, and a lot of, like in your scenario, physical sweat and hard work.
Yeah.
And it's easy to underestimate that. But if you got overwhelmed with everything you were going to have to do, most of us would never want to tackle it.
Yeah, but I think you're saying like if it was easy, it wouldn't be worth doing. It's totally true. It's funny actually about the blacksmithing class. So the thing that like pushed me over the edge into slight despair was, you're using a hammer to hit hot metal and to shape it, right? And so after all these years of doing home improvement projects with my dad and swinging a hammer, like I'm like pretty decent at swinging a hammer. So I was like, oh, I can do this. The technique for swinging a blacksmith hammer is the total opposite of swinging a hammer to hit a nail. So like the years of doing projects with my dad worked against me. So it wasn't even just that like I would have to learn all this blacksmithing stuff. It was like I'm literally gonna have to unlearn swinging a hammer and relearn how to do it.
Nice.
That was like, oh, this is gonna be tough.
Whole different set of skills.
Oh, totally.
Set of skills. So last question. One of the things we like to wrap up with is asking folks how they can get in touch with you. If people are interested in kind of learning more or hearing the band's music or anything, how do they find you online?
Yeah. So the best way to get a hold of me is probably Twitter, which is at oysterpig. I also have an Instagram that is the same, at oysterpig. If you ever want to see food, you also have to see pictures of my daughter.
Nice. There you go.
No one's complained about that. The Instagram,
no, nobody's going to.
Yeah.
No.
But I post a lot of the stuff there. And as far as bands, I'd have to look up what the current band I'm in doesn't have anything that we haven't done a recording.
Well, and that's cool. So pretty soon you guys will be down in Richmond, and we'll follow up, and I'll be curious to kind of hear what's going on with the music when you get down in there.
Yeah.
So next time I'm coming through or whatever, and you guys are down there, we'll stop and kind of touch base again, chat from that way.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, that sounds good.
Yeah.
Well, good. Well, I appreciate it, Ryan. Thank you.
Yeah, and thank you. I'm glad we got to do this. This is fun.
Me too. It's really enjoyable, and I appreciate you making time for me on a Sunday evening before we kind of get back into things.
Yeah, no problem.
All right. Thanks for doing the podcast, Ryan. I had a blast catching up and chatting, so thanks again. If you like the episode, shoot me an email and let me know. In fact, to show my appreciation, I'll send you a few stickers and buttons as my way of saying thanks. You can reach me at headheartandhustle@gmail.com. You can also get email updates from me, which are fairly inconsistent, I'll admit. Depends on how busy my life gets. Visit headheartandhustle.com/newsletter to sign up for those. Remember that you can find us on the web at headheartandhustle.com, and of course, we're all over social media. Our logo was created by my friend Meg Shearer. If you're digging that, you can check out her other work on Society 6. The music you hear each episode was written and performed by my friends in the band Starch to Sugar. You can check them out at starchtosugar.com and on Facebook. Lastly, if you're interested in being interviewed for a future episode, contact me at headheartandhustle@gmail.com. As always, thank you so much for listening. Now go create something.